when Rowan Williams was out here, one of the high points of my Lewis life was that I did a Q&A with Rowan Williams. Those of you that don't know, Rowan Williams is the former Archbishop of Canterbury and had written a book on C.S. Lewis, and he was at the Epiphany Parish, which was just an amazing thing. And I was able to do a Q&A with him. So at the time, I said it was a little bit like being asked to play an exhibition match with Roger Federer. Then I realized I just had to toss him the balls. I didn't actually have to return, which was, but I asked him, what was his favorite vignette? And he had one that actually came from The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan breathed the world into creation. So, I think as you read Narnia, you'll collect your own favorite vignette. I have my own, which happens to come from The Horse and His Boy, and maybe yours is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I want to do a little bit of reading from the book because that's the joy of Lewis. He's fun to read. You can lose yourself into the world of Lewis. And then finally, I want to take questions. A number of questions have been submitted, many by Kelly Martin, so I want to thank her for that, for taking the time to do that. But I think there'll be questions of general interest. Gar will be tracking the questions that are coming in, and I'll get to them. I'll try to not answer the ones that I can't answer, so we'll just do a little bit of editorial license on our side. Just joking. So let's get on with it. First, on the background. So these books were written in the late 40s, early 50s. He wrote 7 of them, basically kind of a book a year. He was doing them. The first book, of course, is dedicated to Lucy. Lucy was his goddaughter and the daughter of Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings and a huge influence on Lewis's life. As I mentioned last week, he is the one that Lewis credits with getting rid of his, quote, historical snobbery. I won't go through all of that again, but that is the same person. And so it's interesting to think of Lucy, I think, as a 10-year-old when he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And as Lucy got older, he continued to write books. So you'll notice throughout the writing, the books get a little bit more sophisticated, the language gets a little bit more sophisticated, and in many ways the topics get a little bit more sophisticated. I mean, the theology in The Last Battle, which deals with the book of Revelation, is incredibly complicated and sophisticated theology to deal with. And frankly, as a non-theologian, it's the only way I've ever understood the book of Revelation is The Last Battle. But it's interesting to think of Lucy in Lewis's mind writing to her as he writes these books through progression. It's also interesting to note that historically Lewis was in a, he had I think a joyful life by his definition. He was, meeting with the Inklings twice a week, having pints at they called it the Bird and the Eagle. I'm trying to remember the name of that. It's what Lewis called it and what it's officially named, but, meeting with the Inklings, sitting around the fire, having great thoughts, enjoying his work. But his home life was challenging. He was, his brother Warnie was a binge drinker and would disappear at times and not be helpful, and also was a worry. Mrs. Moore, who, as you may recall, was Patty Moore's mother, and his Oxford buddy who died in the war, he took responsibility for taking care of Mrs. Moore, and her daughter Maureen, who was much younger than Lewis. They all lived in this house called the Kilns that Warnie and Mrs. Moore and Lewis pooled their resources. Most of the Lewis resources came from Albert, the father's, after the father's death. They took their inheritance and invested into that place. And Mrs. Moore was, she was kind of a terror. She would terrorize the maid and the people that would come in and help. There was always argument. She had a dog that she would ask Lewis to walk. So imagine you're C.S. Lewis. You're responding to all these letters You've done Mere Christianity. You've done the Screw Tape Letters. You've been on the front page of the of Time magazine. You're a world famous apologist. You're still not tenured because you work for Oxford and they're idiots. Won't go into that again. But and then you walk in the door of your house and it's like stepping on a rake. It just bam, hits you right in the face. And it gives you all of the stresses associated with that. So he had a very mixed life. And, one of the questions that was asked is, why are you attracted to Lewis? Why are people attracted to Lewis? And I think it's because he comes from the reality of life. He speaks to us because he is living life. He's not, in an ivory tower or, living on a castle somewhere, living in an alternate reality. He lives in our reality. And so I want to read, Dwight gave me feedback last week, always helpful, that I put the books up and down too quickly. So here it is. Oop, extra stickum. I want to read from the Latin letters what correspondence that Lewis had with an Italian priest in Italy. Their only common language was Latin. So, I could read it in Latin naturally, just joking, but I'll read the English translation. So I want you to know there's both translations. So the overachievers in the group get this book and read it in Latin. Hagar, could you hand me my glasses? I just want you to know that when I first read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I did not need glasses. So this is a letter. This is almost exactly when he is writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so here we go. As for my work, I would not wish to deceive you with vain hope. I am now in my 50th year. I feel my zeal for writing and whatever talent I originally possessed to be decreasing. Nor, I believe, do I please my readers as I used to. I labor under difficulties, many difficulties. My house is unquiet and devastated by women's quarrels. I have to dwell in the tents of Kedar. My aged mother, worn out by long infirmity, is my daily care. Pray for me, Father, that I ever bear in mind that profoundly true maxim, if thou wish to bring others to peace, keep thyself in peace. So that is where Lewis was at least in part of his life when he was writing. I just want to note that he wrote that in 49. And so remember, I feel that my zeal for writing, I look like Chuck Schumer, just joking. I just want to note that he wrote, my zeal for writing, nor do I please my readers. So 1950, he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. 51, Prince Caspian. 52, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. 53, Silver Chair. 54, Horse and His Boy. 55, Magician's Nephew. Last Battle. Till We Have Faces. The Problem of Pain. I mean, he did not, let's not forget, The Four Loves, Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer. Let us not forget that he did not lose his knack for writing. But the important thing is that's where he felt. That's where he felt he was at. So now I was also given feedback that I tend to digress and go off in strange tangents. And to that, I can only say guilty as charged. I now want to go to another book. Dwight said I should count to 10. Okay. Happy, Dwight? That was 5. That's all I'm going to do. Okay. So we mentioned that that people were starting to really correspond with Lewis, particularly after he published these works. And he got tons and tons of letters from children. And in fact, late in his life, when he was failing, he would write back and saying, please don't have your class write me letters because I feel obligated to respond and this is becoming difficult to me. But the letters to children are incredible. They are nuanced and never talked down to children. He never made things overly simple. And you know, one of the questions is what's great about Lewis? I think that's what's great about Lewis. He never patronized. He always speaks clearly. And that is why adults can continue to read Narnia. It's because, you know, they're not children's books in the sense that they're simple. They're incredibly new. They're understandable and enjoyable, should not be held against them. Gar and I did a thing where we looked at the percentage of books that are read, and you can do that on Amazon. And most of these great books that people talk about, they read like less than 2% of them, statistically speaking. So if we were to do some equation, I think we would see that Lewis's books are read 100%, and that's because they're good. I could tell you a whole bunch of authors that I'm just slammed, but I won't do that because this is Sunday and I'm a moderately good person on Sundays. So here's the question from a May 6 letter, 1955. And this is from Mrs. K. Her last name has been dealt out. And so this is the response to Mrs. K. Tell Lawrence, and I'm going to jump through the letter a lot. It's a long letter. Mrs. K had written a letter that was saying Lawrence was concerned that he was starting to love Aslan more than Jesus. Isn't that great? And Lewis is responding to that. Tell Lawrence from me, with my love, even if he was loving Aslan more than Jesus, I'll explain in a moment why he can't really be doing this, he would not be idol worshiping. If he was an idol worshiper, he'd be doing it on purpose. Whereas now he's doing it, because he can't help doing it and trying hard not to. But God knows him quite well, how hard we find it to love him more than anything else. And he won't be angry with us as long as we're trying, and he will help us. Point 2, but Lawrence can't really love Aslan more than Jesus, even if he feels that's what he's doing. For the things he loves Aslan for doing or saying are simply the things Jesus really did and said. So that when Lawrence thinks he is loving Aslan, he is really loving Jesus, and perhaps loving him more than he ever did before. Of course, there is one thing Aslan has that Jesus has not. I mean, the body of a lion. But remember, if there are other worlds and they need to be saved and Christ were to save them as he would, he may really have taken on all sorts of bodies in them, which we don't know about. Okay, and then I'll skip a point, then I'll go, if I were Lawrence, I'd just say in my prayers something like this: Dear God, if the things I've been thinking and feeling about those books are things you don't care and like are bad for me, please take them away, those feelings and bad thoughts. And, let me see. There was another great. Then further on in that prayer, this is so good. And if Mr. Lewis has worried any other children by his books or done them any harm, then please forgive him and help him never do it again. I mean, isn't that just great? I have one other letter from the children's books that I'll reference before I jump around too much. It's a letter from 1958. It doesn't say to whom it is. Anyway, I think it's to a girl named Lucy. Dear Lucy, you've got it exactly right. A strict allegory is like a puzzle with a solution. A great romance is like a flower whose smell reminds me of something you can't quite place. I think the something is the whole quality of life as we actually experience it. You can have a realistic story in which all the things and people are exactly like those we meet in real life, but the quality, the feel or texture or smell of it is not. In a great romance, it's just the opposite. I've never met orcs or ents or elves, but the feel of it, the sense of a huge past, the lowering danger of heroic tasks achieved by the most apparently unheroic people of distance and vastness, strangeness, homeliness, all blended together is so exactly what living feels like to me. Particularly the heartbreaking quality in the most beautiful places like Lothlorien. And it is so like the real history of the world. So what Lewis is talking about is first, his work is not strict allegory. He is not doing Bunyan, where this relates to that, where you can find the characters and their direct similarity and the actions they took. He created a world of Narnia that was a world of imagination, as we saw in the earlier letter to Lawrence. What would happen if Christ were to go to a world of Narnia? And of course, Aslan, of course, is the Christ figure. But we can't look to say Lucy is this figure, Edmund is that figure, the Queen is this figure. He is just playing a fantasy scenario where we can see and test the dynamics of evil, of pride, of change, of temptation, of journey. And so it's really the big themes that we're picking up in the world of Narnia. The other point that I would make is the power of fantasy. He liked fantasy. He liked a different world. And the reason is that when things are in our own world, when we have our own direct context, we take all of our understanding of things and just place it, so we pattern match so actively that we sometimes miss the point because our own experience, our own associations overwhelm what the author is saying. But you can't do that with a beaver. You can't do that with a fawn because, most of us don't know those creatures. And if we do, we certainly have not spoken with them. And if we have, you've got an issue. So that you can see dynamics, you can see the fantasy. Fantasy allows you to see things that you couldn't otherwise see because of the change of context. That is the power of fantasy. That is the power of science fiction. It communicates to us in a different way. And Lewis uses that medium so well. Okay, now on to quotes from the book. And I will note, I am now on my fourth point. So I am being organized. Take that. So I'm just gonna go through a few sections of the book that I really love. And really, I do this one because I like to share these things, but it's also to sort of encourage you when you read to highlight the things you really like. And then when you go back to an old book, so here I go, count to 10, old book. So this is, I think, the original Narnia book from the 1970s, which makes me old. But also demonstrates that I've actually read this book and that maybe a dog has chewed on this book. This is with Mr. Beaver. And this is chapter 8, What Happened After Dinner. And so, you know that they're, well, you've just read the book, so I don't need to tell you this, but Edmund's been in and out of Narnia, or Lucy, I can't remember. Lucy came in and out of Narnia, then Edmund came with her, then Edmund denied it, and there was great disaster. And then they all stumble into Narnia through the wardrobe when they're hiding from the cleaning people, or the tourists coming through the Mr. Kettle's castle, mispronouncing the last name. And so now they're in Narnia, and they have found their way to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's house. And the great line is they're anxious. They're aware that there's trouble in the land. And Mr. Beaver says, "It's no good your trying of all people, but now that Aslan is on the move." Just want to pause on that. Aslan is on the move. That the sense, the power of the sense that Aslan is moving, that there is change happening. That's the thing to really embrace. And then, of course, Susan says, "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" said Mr. Beaver. "Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood, but not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll settle the White Witch all right. It is he, not you, that will save Mr. Tumnus." Skipping ahead, is he a man? asked Lucy. "Aslan, a man?" said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of the beast? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Oh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." Now, great Lewis quote. "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly." Now, this is the line. "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." Now, those of you that would want to adhere to a Christ-centric view of the Bible or of literature, I defy you to find a better set of lines than that, honestly. Just so good. Moving forward, of course, speaking of Aslan, we know how the book goes. He sacrifices himself for Edmund, substitutes himself for Edmund. No small amount of theology in that, and is killed. And then he's bound up, and then the mice tear the lines off, and the children go. The two women go to the table. Another set of allusions there. And they turn around, and there's Aslan standing behind them. "Oh, Aslan," cried both the children, staring up at him, almost too frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead, then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say it. "A ghost." Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real. You're real. Oh, Aslan," cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him. And then they say, "What does this mean?" "It means," says Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards." Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Then going forward, there's the great battle. Edmund rises and becomes a much better kid, and they fight. The battle is lost, and Lucy has got her. You remember, she gets a magic potion that can heal somebody, and they basically want to pause and take a moment after the battle. And then Aslan says, and I just love this line, "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others are also at the point of death. Must more die for Edmund?" And then they go. So it's this wonderful sense of Lewis always has about the need to keep moving, the need to take decisions, the need to act, that I think makes this his works so powerful. One of his key themes is personal choice. That one of the great, one of my other favorite, there's so many favorite vignettes, is when Jill is on Eustace. This is in, what is it? I think it's Prince Caspian. I think it's our next book. She's tricked. No, it's too wind down. Anyway, moving on. She's tricked Eustace, and Eustace has fallen off the cliff, and Aslan has blown him to Narnia, and she is crying. And Aslan says to her, "Crying is all well and good, child, but after a while you have to stop and decide what you're going to do." So that notion of even after the great battle, that's not it. We don't get to stop. We have to decide what we're going to do. And that is captured there. Lucy, the hero on so many dimensions, she doesn't get a break. She has to stop. She has a job to do. She has to move forward. And perhaps that's what Lewis felt in his life as he was writing these books from moments of time from despair. And that is what's so powerful. And now, my next point, I want to go to questions. God, where's that sheet of paper I had?
Well, we've got, I'll read
No, what? Oh, let me, okay. And can you hand me that sheet of paper where I have questions?
So the first question, you might have to kind of reiterate it, but on the power of fantasy, what contemporary fantasy books are descendants of Lewis? Harry Potter, Hunger Games, maybe Roald Dahl?
Okay, so it's sort of descendants of Lewis, and I'm gonna give myself a little safety, because I'm going to say Lewis and Tolkien, because Lewis is and one of the questions I had before is what's the difference between Lewis and Tolkien. So I'm gonna merge these two things together. I think Lewis's work, particularly in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's first and foremost a good story, and he would say that first and foremost the important thing is to tell us a good story. But it is pretty explicitly Christian. I mean, once you understand the role of Aslan, then it's hard not to read it through that lens. Whereas you could read Lord of the Rings and not read it in any way, shape, or form as an explicitly Christian work, even though it quite clearly is. But and that's a topic of another webinar. But I can't think of anybody that's broadly popular that was as explicit in that as Lewis. But I can think of a massive influence of Lewis and Tolkien. And this is the influence. It really has a lot to do with the curriculum at Oxford. They were both on the review committee related to what the curriculum would be. And they were adamant that English literature should go back to Beowulf, that it wasn't going to be just modern literature or modern creation. People basically wanted to do Shakespeare to present and not go back. And they forced the curriculum to stay back into the Middle Ages, back to Nordic myth, and back to these great Edda myths, if you go back to their attachment to Icelandic myth and Norse myth. And so they had a whole range of students who studied that and were deep into early mythology. And that is absolutely had a huge impact. And I would say the whole, genre, even if I can't say this for sure, but if you, roll forward into like Game of Thrones and all this stuff, I mean, we have this, there's all this echo from from that early mythological foundation. I would say that, and I picked that up from a lecture. There is a Tolkien continuing lecture, and there was a woman author, a very well published author. I can't, her name slips my mind. I apologize. And they said, what was the impact of studying under Tolkien at Oxford? And Tolkien actually wasn't a great teacher. He would kind of mumble and talk to himself, and then people only really liked him when he broke into Old Norse and quoted Beowulf and stuff. But what he did do was force the curriculum to remain medieval, basically. And she said it was that is what influenced me and this entire genre of work. I would also say that the themes, that Tolkien, I'm gonna make a related question that I got from Kelly, which is sort of the difference between Tolkien and Lewis. And I'll say something as a guy that loves Lewis. I think people will be reading Tolkien's fantasy and The Lord of the Rings 100 years from now, and more than they'll be reading the Narnia, because Tolkien created original myth. I mean, what Tolkien created is unbelievable. You have to go back to the Odyssey to find a world that's been created with so much imagination, so much nuance, so much depth. Many languages, many created entire histories to put the characters in. Tolkien created a fundamental world. I mean, he created new myth, but it was a myth that operated entirely within a Christian framework. I mean, if you want to understand good and evil, you'd be hard pressed to find anything better than the Ring to capture the power and the allure of evil than Tolkien. And I think that carries forward to, say, Harry Potter series. The author of Harry Potter was asked by the Guardian newspaper after the third book if it was a Christian work, and she said, of course. She's a Scottish, kind of like a Methodist, I think. Anyway, but yes, she is a Christian, and she goes, of course it's a Christian work, and I don't want to tell you too much because you will know how the books end, so many other books later. But she operates within a Christian framework. She is explaining things within that context. And so I think she found her way to that in her own right. But in that sense, she's very, very similar to Tolkien and Lewis and people that have written this great literature: good, evil, struggle, journey, choice. Those are the elements of those works. So how about that for a 5-minute answer to a 1-minute question? Okay, Gar?
This is kind of related. This is from email. If The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe were published today, how do you think it would do? How would it be received by readers and critics?
If The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe were published today, how would it do and how would it be received? I have to admit, I'm a little disheartened by our current age and our current age of profound cynicism and this sort of, I'll call it, faux intellectual elitism. We can have a whole nother webinar on why I think that's just silly, and we could, as Christians, take those guys to the intellectual mat, but that's beyond the scope of this question. I think that the kids would love it. The stories are wonderful. I think the cynicism of our age would make it hard for them to be as broadly accepted as they were then. I think the explicit Christianity of them would have people think that they're overly simple. And of course, that would just principally make them idiots, but that would be I'm concerned that would be part of the general response. And then all of us people that actually love good literature and love great stories might feel a little, oh, geez, am I reading something that's not up to snuff with these, complete morons? Yeah, how about that? I got to remember it's Sunday morning. I'm trying to be a better person. Okay.
Okay, two come in. So very simply, what does CS stand for in C.S. Lewis?
Okay, 2 questions. What does C.S. Lewis stand for? Clive Staple Lewis.
There you go. And then of his books, which are the best one for elementary age children?
of his books, what are the best for elementary age children? Well, clearly, you just can't beat the Narnia series. You know, and then as you get a little older, his science trilogy is really good and not very well, you know, not widely read, 1939 series, but you know, Out of a Silent Planet is a fabulous book. So as you move into your early teens, go back to his science trilogies, written starting, I think, in 1939. Really fabulous stuff. Another related question. Oh God, I got the books. This is great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See, these are it's a trilogy of these books. These are fabulous. So if you're enjoying Lewis fantasy and fiction and all that kind of stuff, you've got a whole nother space trilogy to read that is really, really good. But for younger kids, Narnia is really just kind of off the charts, and you can't really beat it. Kind of a related question is another book. Gar, I'm going to ask you to do this if you can find it. I've got books all over. This is a little office that Gar and I've created for other stuff, and it's a mess. I am looking for. Oh God, the name slips my mind. It's just his favorite book. His favorite book. Anyway, it'll come back to me once I'm not being such
My favorite Screwtape Letters.
Not the Screwtape Letters. No, that's not it. Anyway, next question, Gar. I've lost my train of thought. I'm just kicking myself on that book. Occurred to me in a second.
So it's what are the biggest similarities between Tolkien works and Lewis works?
Biggest similarities between Tolkien works and Lewis works. You know, they're really quite different. Tolkien actually hated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the reason is he can't stand the fact that Lewis violated essentially the principle of the entire fantasy world. He hated the fact that Father Christmas came into Narnia, because for him that was just an incredible violation of sort of the mode of it. So they didn't always love each other's works. And in fact, I think Lewis dedicated the Screwtape Letters to it, and Tolkien didn't particularly like that book either. Tolkien didn't fundamentally like the fact that Lewis was such an overt Christian apologist. Tolkien was a strong Catholic, went to Mass every single day, continued to say Mass in Latin even after Vatican II, and he just felt that Lewis, as a layman, should not be so explicitly and openly Christian, that was for the clergy. So they didn't always appreciate the work. Lewis, on the other hand, loved Tolkien's work. In fact, Tolkien credits Lewis for having him complete Lord of the Rings. He said, you know, without Lewis's, quote, sheer encouragement, I could not have completed the Lord of the Rings, and he would have been lost in Middle Earth forever. So that, you know, they had a really interesting relationship. But, you know, I just want to to sort of capture the power of let me see here. I got one book, and I'm starting to, God, I'm so mad at myself for forgetting the book. But, you know, their relationship, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, this is sort of just such a famous relationship. So imagine in the late 30s, sitting in a little room at Oxford around a fire and hearing The Hobbit read for the first time. I mean, wow, isn't that cool? And Lewis reading all of his other works and things like that. So they had a powerful relationship, but they're very, very different, right? You know, well, Tolkien was like banging around Middle Earth for like 15 years. Lewis wrote like 10 books, you know, so Lewis wrote quickly. And in fact, you know, you'll find inconsistencies across the Narnia tales. And if Lewis had lived longer, he would have redone the Narnia series, not changed them fundamentally, but cleared up some of the inconsistencies on when characters appear and logic flow, right? Tolkien never would have made any mistakes. He was OCD, man. He was just getting every single detail right. He was a perfectionist. So I think the neat thing about their relationship is that they are so different. Yeah, but very, very different guys.
Okay, so this
Next question.
At 11, I think we're coming to the last one.
Oh, we're getting near the end. I went long last week, and I apologize for that. This is supposed to be 45 minutes. Jad's starting to kind of like, if we weren't sort of, you know, quarantined, Jad would be on the side giving me the sign. Okay.
Instead, I will.
It's a girl. It's fine.
So which Lewis book hasn't been as popular as you think it should have been?
Oh, the book that I forgot.
There you go.
It just came to me. It's Till We Have Faces. Can you find that?
Till We Have Faces.
Lewis's favorite. Oh, the question was which book is not as popular as it should have been, and that, or should be, and that is Till We Have Faces. That I think I can declaratively say that that is the case. Maybe we don't have it. So I didn't. It's not on my office floor. Till We Have Faces was actually Lewis's favorite book, or one of his two favorite books. People said, you know, what's your greatest, you know, what's your best work? And he thinks it's Till We Have Faces. Oh, here we go. Got it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is really a fabulous book. And it's a novel. It's a whole world that Lewis creates. It's got complicated characters. It is not explicitly Christian. You would not read this book and view it as a Christian work, but it is a amazing and nuanced and powerful story. It is Kate Welch's favorite book, actually, a Lewis book. Those of you that remember her just a few years ago as our associate pastor, Kate, that's her favorite Lewis book, is Till We Have Faces. And it's kind of a hard read. I mean, you've got to kind of get into the world a little bit in order to do it. And, you know, honestly, I think I've got to read it a couple more times to really get it. But if you were to say, you know, what's the #1 powerful underread Lewis book, I think it would declaratively be Till We Have Faces. As and sort of another underappreciated book, Gar, is The Abolition of Man, which sort of after Mere Christianity is sort of a powerful book. Abolition of Man is really a commentary on society. It too is not explicitly Christian. It is really principally a case for belief. It makes the case that society should be oriented around, oh, we got it. 1, 2. Now, Dwight's going to complain about something else, always does, but he can't complain about the fact that I didn't hold the books up long enough. But it's a complicated book, and it has some very complicated constructs, but I do believe that it is timely. I do believe that it makes the case that, I just got a quote, nice job for holding up the books. Thank you, Dwight. I can see it on the screen. This is so cool. I mean, this is actually great. We don't actually have to physically be around people. We could just sit here and do this little text and video thing. Hopefully not. Just joking. I do want to see people. But it's a wonderful book that is dealing with timely topics that are relevant today. So on the fiction side, read Till We Have Faces, and on the nonfiction side, go back to The Abolition of Man. After you've done Mere Christianity, Surprised by Joy, Screw Tape Letters, The Great Divorce, I would do those first, be honest with you. Then I would hit Abolition of Man. And after you've done Narnia, I would go and do the Space Trilogy. And the greatest works, I mean, not the greatest, because I think it's all really great, but if you're going to sort of read the fundamental Lewis canon, you know, Mere Christianity, as many times as you can read it, the Narnia, you know, as many times as you can read it, Screw Tape Letters and The Great Divorce is really what you need to do. And for next week, the next book in the series, I think it's Caspian. Thank you, Valerie. I just got your text. This is so good. Prince Caspian is the next book, And then after that, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Now, I want to note that when you buy Narnia today, they come in a different order. So that what they have done with the most recent publication is they do it chronologically. So they do it at the beginning of the Narnia stories. So they start with the magician's nephew, and then the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So they've kind of turned it on, from just, when it began and when it ended. I don't think that's the right way to read the books. I think we should read them in the order in which they were published. So this is actually confusing, and that's a great question, because those of you at home would be thinking, oh, next book is Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the reason for this is that the Narnia series is about the evolution of the kids' understanding of Aslan. And so you need to read them in the order in which Aslan appears. Because if you read The Magician's Nephew, Aslan's already been introduced. He was introduced in the book that Lewis had, in real time had written before then. So I think we should stick with the original order of publication and not be caught by the modern whims of editors who don't understand the character evolution of Aslan. I should also note that I don't think we're meeting next week because it's drum roll to Easter, and I think I've been knocked off the agenda. So stay tuned for communications from Jad on when I'm next up, but I think I'm 2 weeks out, Guard, you remember? 2 weeks out. After Easter, we resume, and correct. Oh yeah, I got another thing from Elizabeth Walker. Well done scheduling. Okay, that's it.
That's it.
And then I'm 3 minutes over, so we're getting better every day and in every way. I hope sincerely everybody is staying safe. I hope your family is safe and well. I hope you're not going stir crazy in your home. And I dearly look forward to being able to interact with all of you in a more personal way going forward. And I thank you for sharing my love and passion for Lewis. And I have to say, it's just a tremendous treat to be able to share my enthusiasm with all of you. So thank you and have a great day.